Hello, my name is Julie Watkins and I attend DePaul University. Thank you so much for being here as I present on the placemaking power of the pedestrian mall. Often when planners hear pedestrian mall, it evokes a negative reaction as they're generally considered a fad and a failure of planners in the 1960s and 70s. However, there's been a burgeoning effort to reintroduce pedestrian-friendly squares and plazas to engage in the popular concept of placemaking. I'm here today to assert that these open, multi-use spaces build opportunity into the environment. In looking at Iowa City, Iowa's pedestrian mall as a case study, together we'll examine this particular mall's success to confirm that planners should regard the pedestrian mall as best practice adjacent. The placemaking power of the pedestrian mall facilitates an environment of community and consumerism while also bringing into question who is able to experience the benefits of the mall. In remedying its inequities, the pedestrian mall should be, in fact, held up as best practice. According to Dave Amos, a pedestrian mall is a street where private motorized traffic has been permanently eliminated and pedestrians have priority. And in the words of Project for Public Spaces, placemaking is a collaborative process by which we can shape our public realm in order to maximize shared value. That sounds a bit vague, but that's because placemaking is not only a planning practice, but also a philosophy. Placemaking became what it is today through the work of William White, a sociologist of New York City who worked on its parks and plazas in the 1960s. He called his writings the Street Life Project, which later transformed into the organization we know today as Project for Public Spaces, or PPS. Known as the go-to on all things placemaking, PPS has established much of the theory that great placemaking hinges on today. One of these concepts that plays out beautifully in our case study of Iowa City is lighter, quicker, cheaper. Lighter, quicker, cheaper refers to the short-term addition of amenities to a space like seating, flower planters, or even ping pong tables and pianos. Lighter, quicker, cheaper also refers to consistent programming in a space and the addition of temporary structures like sheds as pop-up gathering spaces. At its heart, placemaking is a community-centered, often bottom-up approach which seeks to transform spaces through observation and the subsequent fulfillment of that existing population's wants and needs. Placemaking challenges planners to create cities that are accessible, comfortable, and social. So, how do pedestrian malls come into play? In reaction to the white flight and suburbanization of the 50s and 60s, the goal of the pedestrian mall was to draw Americans back to their downtowns. Suburbanites had actually found it easier to frequent nearby strip malls or shopping malls away from the city center rather than going to their downtowns, but many of these attempts to repopulate downtowns by building pedestrian malls failed, essentially marring their name in the urban planning canon. The first pedestrian mall comes to us in 1959 in Kalamazoo, Michigan, from planner Victor Gruen. He had initially created these plans for Fort Worth, Texas, with a network of highways and parking lots directly situated around the pedestrian mall. However, Fort Worth was unable to realize Gruen's plans. Kalamazoo caught a glimpse and was sold, but being a bit strapped for cash, it forewent the highway and parking lot, leaving a single street to constitute its pedestrian mall. Kalamazoo's mall was deemed a success. Other cities around the country began to follow suit in installing their pedestrian malls in hopes of similarly revitalizing their downtowns. Little did they know they would fail, only having to later remove these malls. After all, according to Sam Staley, only about 15% of the 200 pedestrian malls established by villages and cities across the nation have survived. So, what gives pedestrian malls staying power? According to Dave Amos, the first factor that increases a pedestrian mall's chance at prosperity is its proximity to an anchor, such as a university, hospital, or tourist attraction. The second factor is nice weather, in terms of tropical or Mediterranean climates versus those in more humid climates. And the most important thing that planners of the past overlooked is the necessity of having an already existing pedestrian population to occupy the mall. Quoting from Sam Staley, the key is to use the pedestrian mall to reinforce existing travel patterns. The danger is to use the mall concept as a way to re-engineer pedestrian travel in the city, unquote. And I'm quoting again, when many cities installed them in the 1960s and 70s, little thought was put into what would happen in the reclaimed space. Lacking a clear purpose, these malls were often devoid of public activity and became empty spaces, which at their worst were consumed by crime and loitering, unquote. With simply an empty swath of land and no initiatives to engage in placemaking, it's no wonder these malls failed. New pedestrian spaces take care to distance themselves from previous stigmas surrounding pedestrian malls by calling themselves squares or plazas. It's next necessary to present Iowa City, Iowa's pedestrian mall as our case study, and it's colloquially referred to as the Ped Mall. Lying in the heart of the downtown, the Ped Mall unites the town's various populations, from students at the nearby University of Iowa, residents, and youth of the community. Built in 1977, the Ped Mall itself is not much beyond a brick-laid carless street, and what constitutes the Ped Mall is highlighted here in red. What exists on the Ped Mall is small businesses, shops, restaurants, and bars, among other things. So, how is the Ped Mall perfect for placemaking? Without a clear directive on what the space invites its inhabitants to do, pedestrian malls become a space that can be utilized for nearly any purpose, making them perfect to engage in placemaking. There's endless possibility in the placemaking power of open space as it waits to be occupied, and pedestrian malls are a way in which planners can actually build that possibility into the environment. The main organization that helps Iowa Cityans create place on the Ped Mall is the Summer of the Arts. It hosts annual cultural festivals, some of which continue throughout the summer, including Arts Fest, Jazz Fest, Soul Fest, the Friday Night Concert Series, and the Free Movie Series, all of which are free and open to the public. In an interview with a University of Iowa student, the student spoke to how he uses the Ped Mall as a place to spontaneously gather. Quote, on a lot of Friday nights, we won't even be planning to go to the concert series, but we'll just come upon it and stick around and see what happens, unquote. This harks back to William White's assertion that the biggest draw a space can have is other people occupying it. This, of course, is why many unoccupied pedestrian malls of the past remained unoccupied, and why Iowa City's mall stays well used. My research on pedestrian malls has primarily taken place prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. However, the placemaking power of the pedestrian mall stops for nothing. I've witnessed how the pedestrian mall has safely brought people together at this time, from distance hangouts to live music. The Ped Mall is alive and well. The Ped Mall was also front and center in the lives of Iowa Cityans after the derecho land hurricane on August 10th, leaving many without power and internet. This translated to the Ped Mall being far more populous than usual, with community members sitting on their laptops utilizing the Iowa City Public Library's free Wi-Fi. The Ped Mall has lovingly been referred to as the living room of Iowa City, and it is in the age of the coronavirus pandemic that this has truly lived up to this status. Other ways in which the Ped Mall creates place are through its annual Pride celebration, protests, public art, and of course, its bar scene. Previously named the #1 party school by the Princeton Review, Iowa City's bar life is thriving. In interviews with 4 current University of Iowa students, all of them said they considered their school to be social. When asked about where students gathered, the answer was also unanimous: the bars, all of which are nearly all of which are conveniently located on the Ped Mall. When speaking with one student on why he believes the bars to be the main placemaking mechanism of university students, he said, quote, there's not much else to do downtown on the weekends activity-wise, unquote. This student is speaking to a concept that Gina Ford delineates. Quote, where a mall in a larger city is just one of a number of core downtown spaces, the pedestrian malls of college towns are often the single defining open space of the downtown fabric, allowing for specific focus, unquote. Unlike big cities, college towns tend to be smaller in scale, making a pedestrian mall the true heart of the city. And in the heart of the city, there are bars. And if there are bars, college students are going to use them as a placemaking opportunity. I want to give you an idea of how this looks. On any given Saturday night at 2 a.m., one will see a long line of people waiting for their grilled cheese sandwiches in front of Marco's, a food truck outside of the popular bar Union. The food truck will be gone by the next morning as families pass by piles of vomit on their way to church, but the mere presence of a food truck downtown past the dinner hour and well past midnight manifests that students are using the bars as a means of placemaking on the Ped Mall, although it may seem like the Ped Mall showing its seedy underbelly. Again, we see this harking back to Project for Public Spaces work on how to create a successful place. Quote, simply stated, the more varied the uses of a community space, the more varied the audience becomes, unquote. Now that I've sold you on the Ped Mall, it's time to problematize Iowa City's iteration of the pedestrian mall, specifically in reference to its bar scene in terms of who gets to exist in that space. The bars are anti-BIPOC, or Black and Indigenous people of color, because of their racist dress codes. Quote, like other downtown bars in Iowa City, Brothers employs a racialized dress code. The code bans baggy clothes, flat-brimmed hats, bandanas, and exposed men's underwear. While some bars have explicit signs stating the dress code, others have foregone signage and have instead allowed bouncers to police dress code on a case-by-case basis. I spoke to a University of Iowa student, a white man, about a time in which he had broken this dress code by wearing a tank top on a warm summer night. When bringing this to his attention, the bouncer said, "Just so you know, tank tops aren't supposed to be allowed here," which indicates a sense of fluidity in how this dress code is policed. As a white man, the student was able to go on with his night, but this is often not the case for others. The Yelp pages of the most infamous Iowa City bars, Union and Summit, are chock full of anecdotes about the difference in how these dress codes are policed based on race. Iowa City has come under fire for this. Quote, "The Iowa City Office of Equity and Human Rights reissued a 3-year memorandum providing guidance on dress code and admittance policies due to discriminatory conduct. Regardless of whether this racism is written out on signs or merely espoused from the mouths of bouncers, BIPOC community building takes the hit." BIPOC are also not the only people who have been disadvantaged by the current enactment of Iowa City's Pedestrian Mall. People experiencing homelessness are also pushed to the margins, with perhaps the most visible injustice being benches with armrests down the middle. Iowa City recently installed 70 of these new benches for $150,000. And these benches replaced other benches that were in good working condition, as you can see on the left. There seems to be a politics of rest at hand here, bringing into question who is allowed to engage in rest on the Ped Mall and how. A bench by its nature is an invitation to rest. So when one rests differently than another and is demonized for doing so, rest is politicized and policed at the hands of hostile architecture. Next, it's necessary to pose the question of how the Ped Mall engages in facilitating consumerism. Harking back to its conception, the pedestrian mall was supposed to bolster consumerism, though we've already seen how that has had mixed success. Iowa City's Ped Mall does this through the vast array of local businesses, whether retailers, restaurants, or frozen yogurt shops, that the Iowa City Downtown District, or ICDD, supports through various initiatives. One of the ICDD's initiatives to uplift its local businesses is the Downtown Shop Crawls, modeled in part after bar crawls, which of course Iowacitians are familiar with. In the past, the ICDD has buttressed consumerism through tactical urbanism, which is defined as quick, often temporary, cheap projects that aim to make a small part of a city more livable or enjoyable. By placing pop-up shops in strategic places around the Ped Mall, Iowa City is playing with how people engage with local retailers. These pop-up shops are an example of the placemaking principle, lighter, quicker, cheaper, and allow retailers who already have a storefront on the mall to showcase their goods in a central area of the mall. In doing this, they're potentially reaching a different and broader audience, which can then follow them back to their storefront after their stint in the spotlight. Taking all of this into account, it's now necessary to discern whether or not Iowa City's Ped Mall is best practice. In looking back at my interviews with 4 University of Iowa students, their answers all spoke to the serendipity that the Ped Mall facilitates. This confirmed my biases that I entered this topic of study with. The Ped Mall is the heartbeat of Iowa City, and this is no accident, as seen through the intense work around placemaking that various organizations do. With a community so invested in the vitality of its downtown district, Iowa City's Ped Mall has staying power. Claire Martin's assertions on placemaking perfectly encapsulate why Iowa City's Ped Mall should be considered best practice. Quote, "Placemaking is not simply about reconnecting people with the place, it's about reconnecting people with each other," unquote. Iowa City's Pedestrian Mall is a clear example of a built form that has the capacity to profoundly benefit those who occupy it. It's also clear that Iowa City values its pedestrian mall as it has recently undergone an $8 million renovation. Iowa City's willingness to invest further in its pedestrian mall points to arts, culture, community, and consumerism being alive and well in the Ped Mall. To assess whether or not the pedestrian mall is best practice for Iowa City, or even best practice in general, it's absolutely necessary to revel in its accomplishments in creating place, but more importantly, address the inequities around who is able to properly benefit from the mall. As stated in this presentation, the pedestrian mall excludes BIPOC and people experiencing homelessness in damaging ways. In addressing these hostilities towards marginalized people, the pedestrian mall and its placemaking power should be regarded as best practice. Thank you.